The storm had passed 3 days ago, but the air still tasted of salt and anger. In the forgotten corner of Key West where the respectable folks never wandered, Elias Blackwater worked alone on his ship's hull, the wood scarred and weathered like his own face. The evening sun painted everything gold, but down here in the shadows of the rotting pier, it felt more like rust. His hands moved methodically, patching holes that told stories he'd rather forget. Each gouge in the wood reminded him of cannon fire, of screaming men, of the blood that had once stained these very planks. The Raven's call had been feared across the Caribbean once. Now she was just another broken thing, like her captain. The sound of footsteps on wet wood made him look up. A woman approached, moving carefully between the scattered tools and rope. She wore a simple brown dress, her dark hair pulled back severely, and she kept her face turned slightly away as if the shadows were a shield. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above the lapping waves. "Mr. Jenkins sent me. He said you might need supplies." She held up a canvas bag. "Nails, tar, some rope." Elias straightened, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. "Jenkins, eh? Thought he'd written me off for dead." He studied her face, noting the way she kept her left side turned away from him. A long scar ran from her temple to her jaw, pale against her tanned skin. "You work the docks?" "Sometimes." She set the bag down carefully, her movements precise. "When they need extra hands for loading." She glanced at his ship, taking in the careful repairs. "She's beautiful, even damaged. She's seen better days." Elias picked up a nail from the bag, testing its weight. "Like most of us around here." The woman's hand unconsciously moved to her scarred cheek. "I should go. The tide's changing and I have to help with the evening catch." "What's your name?" The question surprised them both. She hesitated, as if her own name was a secret too dangerous to share. "Marin Hollis." "Elias." He didn't offer his last name. In a place like this, surnames were either lies or liabilities. As she turned to leave, Marin paused. "The scar," she said quietly, not looking back. "Ship's rigging snapped in a storm when I was 16. Caught me right across the face." Her laugh was bitter. "I'm not pretty. Never was. But after that..." Elias had heard confessions whispered over dying fires and last breaths. He recognized the weight of words that had been carried too long. "That's fine," he said simply. "I need honest, not fancy." She turned then, surprise flickering across her features. For a moment, the careful wall she'd built around herself cracked and he saw something fierce and wounded and real. "Most people can't stand to look at me," she said. "Most people are fools." Elias picked up his hammer again. "Besides, I've got my own collection of ugly reminders." He gestured to the deep scar that ran across his throat, nearly hidden by his collar. "Difference between you and me is, you got yours trying to make an honest living. I got mine because I was stupid enough to trust the wrong person with a knife." Marin stared at him for a long moment, as if she was seeing him clearly for the first time. The port around them had gone quiet, except for the eternal whisper of waves against wood. "I'll bring more supplies tomorrow," she said finally. "If you need them." "I'll need them." After she left, Elias continued working as the sun disappeared into the ocean. But his hands moved differently now, with more purpose. The Raven's call had been a ship of war and plunder. Maybe she could be something else, maybe they both could. In the distance, a church bell chimed the hour, and somewhere in the maze of docks and warehouses, Marin Hollis walked home through streets that had never been kind to her. But for the first time in years, she wasn't hurrying to escape the world's gaze. The Caribbean night settled over Key West like a familiar blanket, and two broken souls continued their separate dances with solitude, not yet knowing that loneliness shared is the first step toward something resembling hope. The next evening arrived heavy with humidity and the promise of another storm. Marin walked through the narrow streets of Key West's forgotten quarter, her canvas bag heavier tonight with supplies she'd carefully selected from Jenkins's warehouse. She'd volunteered for the evening shift, something she never did, just to have a reason to return to the docks after dark. The Raven's call sat in the same berth, but something had changed. Lanterns hung from her rigging, casting warm pools of light across the deck where Elias worked. The careful repairs from yesterday had expanded. He'd replaced entire sections of railing and was now working on the ship's wheel, his movements sure and practiced. "You're ambitious," Marin called out as she approached, surprised by her own boldness. Elias looked up and she caught something in his expression that might have been relief. Figured if I'm going to fix her, might as well do it right. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Besides, working keeps the ghosts quiet. She set the bag down on the dock and pulled out a bottle. Brought you something that might help with those ghosts. The rum was good quality. Not the rot gut most dock workers could afford. And some proper food. You look like you've been living on hardtack and stubbornness. Close enough. Elias accepted the bottle gratefully and took a measured sip. His eyes closed briefly in appreciation. This is real rum. The kind they serve in Havana. Not the poison they brew in the back alleys here. I have my sources. Marin climbed carefully onto the ship's deck, testing each board before putting her full weight on it. My father was a merchant sailor before he settled here. Taught me to recognize quality. She ran her hand along the newly repaired railing. He would have loved this ship. Would have? Hurricane took him and 3 others when I was 19. Same storm that brought me this. She touched her scar unconsciously. I was helping secure cargo when the mainmast snapped. The rigging caught me. And Papa... She stared out at the dark water. They never found his body. Elias set down his tools and really looked at her for the first time. In the lantern light, her scar seemed less like a disfigurement and more like a badge of survival. You stayed with the sea after that? Where else would I go? The water took everything, but it's also all I know. She sat on a coil of rope, suddenly weary. Besides, people on land look at me and see something broken. Out here, scars just mean you've lived long enough to earn them. What do you see when you look at me? The question came out rougher than Elias intended. Marin studied his face in the flickering light, the network of fine scars around his eyes from sun and salt spray, the deeper mark across his throat, the way his hands bore the calluses of a lifetime working rope and steel. I see someone who's tired of running from something, someone who's trying to build instead of destroy. She paused. Someone who doesn't flinch when he looks at me. Elias poured rum into a second cup he'd found somewhere in the ship's galley. I spent 15 years taking things apart. Ships, lives, my own soul, piece by piece. He handed her the cup. Last job went wrong. My own crew turned on me over a chest of Spanish gold. Left me for dead in a cave in Puerto Rico. He touched his throat scar. This is where my first mate tried to finish what the cave-in started. But you survived. Barely. Took me 3 months to dig my way out, another 6 to steal a boat and make it back to civilization. He took a long drink. When I finally tracked down my crew, found them drunk and rich in Port Royal, I had a choice. I could go back to being the monster they'd made me, or I could walk away. So you came here, bought this ship with the last of my legitimate money, and sailed until I found a place where nobody asked questions. Elias gestured around the quiet harbor. Been here 2 years, fixing boats for honest pay. Trying to remember what it felt like to sleep without a knife under my pillow. Marin was quiet for so long that Elias began to wonder if he'd shared too much, too soon. But when she spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than afraid. Do you regret it? Walking away from that life? Every day. His honesty surprised them both. Not because I miss the violence, but because, when you've been a certain kind of person for so long, you start to wonder if that's all you're capable of being. He met her eyes. Some days I feel like I'm just playing dress-up, pretending to be civilized. My mother used to say that the best people are the ones who have to work hardest to be good. Marin stood and moved to the ship's bow, looking out over the water. She died when I was small, but I remember her hands. Always gentle, always careful. She said kindness was a choice you made every day, especially when it was difficult. The night air carried the sound of distant music from one of the taverns, a melancholy guitar that seemed to drift across the water like a ghost. Elias joined her at the railing, close enough that he could smell the salt in her hair, the honest smell of hard work and sea air. Why aren't you afraid of me? He asked quietly. Because, Marin said, still looking out at the dark horizon. The most dangerous men I've known were the ones who hurt people and felt nothing. You hurt people, and it ate you alive. That tells me everything I need to know about who you really are. A warm breeze stirred the water, and somewhere in the distance thunder rumbled a lazy warning. Tomorrow would bring another storm, but tonight, on the deck of a pirate ship turned honest, 2 wounded souls sat in comfortable silence and discovered that understanding could bloom in the most unlikely soil. The church bell chimed midnight, and neither of them moved to leave. The storm that had been threatening for days finally arrived on the 3rd week of Marin's evening visits, bringing with it winds that howled like banshees and rain that fell in sheets thick enough to drown a man standing upright. The Raven's call strained against her moorings, but Elias's careful repairs held firm against the Caribbean fury. Maren had taken shelter in the ship's cabin when the first lightning split the sky, and now she sat cross-legged on Elias's narrow bunk, watching him pace the small space like a caged animal. The storm seemed to have awakened something restless in him, something that made his hands twitch toward weapons that weren't there, and his eyes dart constantly to the porthole as if expecting enemies to emerge from the chaos outside. "Tell me about your crew," she said quietly, trying to anchor him to the present. Over the past weeks, they'd shared stories in careful doses. Her childhood helping her father load cargo, his early days learning to read the wind and stars. But the dangerous parts of his past remained locked away, surfacing only in the tension that gripped him during storms like this. Elias stopped pacing and looked at her with something that might have been surprise. "Why would you want to know about them?" "Because they're part of your story, and because you get that look in your eyes every time the weather turns rough, like you're expecting them to come sailing out of the storm." She patted the space beside her on the bunk. "Sit down before you wear a hole in your own deck." He sat, but his body remained coiled tight, ready to spring into action. Outside, thunder crashed so close it seemed to shake the very bones of the ship. Marcus Webb was my first mate. Met him in a Tortuga prison when we were both young and stupid enough to think piracy was romantic. He saved my life in a bar fight, and I returned the favor when the Spanish tried to hang him for stealing their gold. Elias's hands clenched into fists. For 10 years he was the closest thing I had to a brother. What changed? I did. Or maybe I just got tired of watching good men die for treasure that would be spent and forgotten within a month. The ship lurched as a particularly strong gust hit her, and Elias instinctively reached out to steady Maren. His hand lingered on her arm. The last job was supposed to be different. A Spanish merchant vessel carrying medical supplies to their colonies, along with a chest of gold meant to pay the doctors. I wanted to take the gold and leave the medicine. Maren could see where this was heading, but she waited for him to continue. Marcus and the others wanted it all. Said the Spanish were our enemies, that their sick could die for all we cared. Elias's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I'd been having dreams, you see. Dreams of all the people we'd killed, all the ships we'd sent to the bottom. My mother's voice asking me what I'd become. He laughed bitterly. Funny thing about guilt. It builds up slow, then hits you all at once like a rogue wave. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, surrounded by the warm glow of an oil lamp, Maren felt safer than she had in years. So you refused to take the medicine? I tried to. Told them we were thieves, not murderers. That there had to be lines we wouldn't cross. Elias stood and moved to a small chest bolted to the cabin wall. From it, he pulled a worn leather journal and a small silver locket. They voted to relieve me of command. Said I'd gone soft, that I was more liability than leader. He handed her the locket. Inside was a miniature portrait of a woman with kind eyes and graying hair. My mother. She died while I was at sea, before I could make it home to say goodbye. His voice cracked slightly. The locket was in the Spanish chest, along with letters from a doctor in Havana to his wife. Personal things, not treasure at all. Maren studied the portrait, seeing something of Elias in the woman's gentle expression. She looks like she was a good person. She was. Took in every stray cat and broken soul in our village. Always said there was enough cruelty in the world without adding to it. He took the locket back, closing it carefully. The night before they tried to kill me, I dreamed of her again. She was standing on the dock where I used to say goodbye, but this time she was turning away. Couldn't bear to look at what I'd become. Thunder crashed again, closer now, and the ship's lanterns flickered. In the uncertain light, Maren reached out and took Elias's hand. His skin was rough with old scars and honest calluses, but his fingers were surprisingly gentle as they closed around hers. They left you in the cave with the treasure? Marcus put his knife to my throat. This knife, Elias touched his scar, and told me I could die quick or slow, but I was going to die either way. Said I'd betrayed everything we stood for. He was quiet for a long moment. Maybe he was right. Maybe you can't just decide to stop being a monster. But you did stop. Maren's voice was firm. You've been here 2 years, helping people fix their boats, paying fair wages to dock workers. You could have taken another ship, gathered another crew, gone back to the old life. But you didn't. Because I'm a coward. Because every time I think about raising a black flag again, I see my mother's face turning away. No. Maren shifted closer to him on the narrow bunk. Because you're finally the man she raised you to be. The storm was beginning to weaken, the thunder moving farther out to sea, but neither of them seemed to notice. Elias looked at their joined hands, as if he couldn't quite believe they were real. Do you know what the worst part is? He asked. Sometimes I miss it. The freedom, the respect, the way men would step aside when I walked into a room. When you've been feared, being invisible feels like dying. I know something about being invisible, Maren said softly. Before my accident, I was just another face in the crowd. After, I was something people crossed the street to avoid looking at. But you know what I learned? There's a difference between being unseen because you're unremarkable and being unseen because you choose to be. One makes you a victim, the other makes you free. Outside, the rain was gentling from a torrent to a steady patter against the portholes. The worst of the storm had passed, but inside the cabin something fundamental had shifted between them. Maren, Elias said, his voice rough with emotions he'd kept buried for years, if my past catches up with me, if Marcus and the others come looking, then we'll face it together. The words surprised her with their certainty. I'm tired of hiding from the world, Elias. I'm tired of being afraid. He lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so unexpectedly tender that it brought tears to her eyes. You realize what you're saying? What being with me could cost you? I realize that for the first time in my life, someone looks at me and sees something worth protecting instead of something to be pitied or avoided. She touched his scarred cheek with her free hand. That's worth any risk. The storm moved on toward the open ocean, leaving behind the clean smell of rain-washed air and the promise of a clear dawn. In the cabin of the Raven's Call, two souls who had been shaped by violence and loss discovered that love could grow in the most unlikely places, not in spite of their scars, but because of the strength those scars represented. As the first pale light of morning began to filter through the portholes, Elias and Maren fell asleep still holding hands, neither willing to break the connection that had formed between them in the heart of the storm. Outside, Key West slowly awakened to a world made new by rain and wind, and somewhere far out at sea, other ships sailed through the dawn, carrying with them the weight of unfinished business and old debts that would soon demand to be paid. The peaceful days were numbered, but for now, in this moment, there was only the gentle rocking of the ship and the sound of two people breathing in perfect synchronization, finally understanding that they were no longer alone. 3 months had passed since the storm that changed everything between them, and the Raven's Call had been transformed from a broken relic into something approaching her former glory. But more than that, she had become a home. Maren had moved her few possessions aboard after her landlord decided her scarred face was bad for his property's reputation, and Elias had discovered that sharing his space with someone who understood silence could be more comforting than a decade of solitude. They had fallen into rhythms as natural as the tides. Maren working the morning shift at the docks while Elias took on boat repairs for the growing number of fishermen who'd learned to trust his skill, then evenings spent working together on their ship, talking or simply existing in each other's presence. The people of Key West's forgotten quarter had begun to accept them as a pair, the scarred woman and the quiet man who paid his debts and minded his own business. But peace, Elias had learned long ago, was always temporary. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when old Pedro, who ran the tackle shop near the harbor, mentioned seeing an unfamiliar ship anchored just beyond the reef. Big one, he told Maren as she picked up supplies. Flying British colors, but something about her doesn't sit right. Too clean for a merchant vessel, too well armed for anything honest. Maren found Elias replacing the planking on a fishing boat's hull, his movements precise and methodical. When she told him about Pedro's observation, she watched his entire body go still in a way that reminded her of a wolf catching a dangerous scent. How many guns? He asked without looking up from his work. Pedro said at least 20, maybe more. She crouched beside him, studying his face. Elias, what aren't you telling me? He set down his tools and walked to the edge of the dock, staring out toward the horizon where the mysterious ship lay hidden beyond the reef. The Serpent's Tooth carried 24 guns. Marcus always said she was the finest pirate ship in the Caribbean, fast enough to outrun the Navy and strong enough to take anything that couldn't outrun her. The blood drained from Maren's face. You think it's them? I know it's them. Elias's voice was flat, emotionless in the way she'd learned meant he was fighting to keep control. Marcus has a scar shaped like a crescent moon on his left hand. Got it the same night I got this. He touched his throat. Pedro mentioned seeing a man in town yesterday asking about a scarred pirate who worked on boats. man with a moon-shaped scar. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the innocent-looking fishing boats bob in the harbor, knowing that everything they'd built together was about to be tested. "We could run," Marin said quietly. "Take the Raven's Call and sail north. Find another port." They'd follow. Marcus doesn't forgive, and he doesn't forget. Elias turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, but a cold calculation that reminded her he'd once been one of the most dangerous men in the Caribbean. "Besides, I'm tired of running." That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of blood and gold, 3 boats approached the harbor. They flew no flags, and made no effort to conceal the weapons their crews carried openly. Marin and Elias watched from the deck of their ship as the boats tied up at the main dock, and she counted 15 men, all moving with the predatory confidence of those accustomed to taking what they wanted. Marcus Webb stepped onto the dock like a king returning to his rightful kingdom. He was still tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair now streaked with gray, but his presence commanded attention the way it always had. The crescent moon scar on his left hand caught the fading light as he gestured for his men to spread out through the harbor. "Elias Blackwater," his voice carried across the water with practiced authority. "I know you're here, brother. Time we had ourselves a reunion." Elias stepped into view on the deck of the Raven's Call, and Marin saw several of the pirates' hands move instinctively to their weapons. Even after 2 years of honest living, her man still commanded respect. "Marcus," Elias's voice was calm, conversational. "You're looking well. Prison food must agree with you." Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Tortuga wasn't so bad. Gave me time to think, to plan, to remember old friendships and older debts." His eyes found Marin standing beside Elias, and his smile turned predatory. "And who might this lovely creature be?" "Someone under my protection," Elias said, and there was something in his tone that made several pirates take an involuntary step backward. "Your protection?" Marcus's laugh was louder now, more theatrical. "Brother, you seem to have forgotten what happened the last time you tried to protect something. How'd that work out for you?" The harbor had gone eerily quiet. Even the usual evening sounds of the port, gulls crying, rigging creaking, distant conversations, seemed to have died away, as if the very air was holding its breath. "What do you want, Marcus?" "What's mine? The Raven's Call was built with crew money, in case you've forgotten. And there's the matter of the gold you stole from us." Marcus began walking slowly down the dock toward their ship, his men flanking him. "But mostly, I want you to remember your place. You don't get to just walk away from what you are, Elias. A wolf can pretend to be a dog, but the first time it smells blood. I'm not the same man you left in that cave." "No?" Marcus stopped at the bottom of the gangplank leading up to their deck. "Then prove it. Come down here and face me man to man without hiding behind your ship and your woman." Marin felt Elias tense beside her, saw his hand drift toward the knife he still wore at his belt. "Don't," she whispered. "It's what he wants. He's trying to provoke you into becoming the man you used to be." But Marcus had heard her. "Listen to that, boys. The scarred little mouse thinks she can advise Captain Blackwater on matters of honor." His voice dripped with mock sympathy. "Tell me, dear, what happened to your face? Did our Elias give you that scar when you displeased him? He always did have a temper." The words hit their target perfectly. Elias's face went white with rage, then red, and Marin could practically see the careful control he'd built over 2 years beginning to crack. "That's enough," Elias said, his voice dropping to the dangerous whisper she'd heard only once before, during the worst of that long-ago storm. "Is it?" Marcus pulled a pistol from his belt, not aiming it, but letting it rest casually in his hand. "Because I think we're just getting started. See, I've been thinking about our last conversation, about how you said there had to be lines we wouldn't cross. But you crossed a line when you betrayed your own crew, brother. And betrayal." He raised the pistol, pointing it not at Elias, but at Marin. "Betrayal has consequences." The dock erupted into chaos. Elias vaulted over the ship's railing, landing on the dock in a crouch with his knife already in his hand. 2 of Marcus's men moved to intercept him, but they had forgotten what Elias Blackwater in a killing rage looked like. The first man went down with a thrown knife in his shoulder before he could draw his sword. The second found himself facing a man who had learned to fight dirty in a dozen different ports and lasted about as long as a candle in a hurricane. But there were too many of them, and Marcus still had his gun trained on Marin. That's more like it, Marcus called out over the sounds of fighting. There's the brother I remember, but you always were too sentimental, Elias. It's going to get you killed. Marin had not survived on the docks of Key West by being helpless. While Marcus's attention was focused on the fight, she slipped back into the ship's cabin and emerged with Elias's old cutlass, the one he'd kept hidden in the chest with his mother's locket. The blade sang as she drew it, and the sound made Marcus turn just in time to see her leap from the ship's deck to the dock below. She landed badly, her ankle twisting, but stayed on her feet and brought the cutlass up in a guard position her father had taught her years ago. "If you want to get to him," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, "you'll have to go through me." Marcus stared at her for a moment, then burst into delighted laughter. "Oh, this is beautiful. The mouse has teeth." He gestured to his remaining men. "Take her alive, boys. I want Elias to watch what happens when people try to stand against Marcus Webb." What followed was chaos in its purest form. Marin fought with the desperation of someone who had finally found something worth dying for, her blade weaving patterns of silver in the fading light. She wasn't skilled enough to defeat trained pirates, but she was determined enough to make them work for every inch, and determination could be its own kind of weapon. Elias carved through Marcus's crew like a man possessed, but for every pirate he dropped, two more seemed to take their place. Blood ran on the dock planks, some of it his own, and he could feel the familiar cold rage building in his chest, the thing that had once made him legend and nightmare in equal measure. Then Marcus's gun fired. The sound cut through everything else, and for a moment that lasted forever, the fighting stopped. Marin dropped to one knee, her hand pressed to her side where blood was beginning to seep between her fingers. "There," Marcus said with satisfaction. "Now we can have a proper conversation." Elias went perfectly still, and in that stillness, every man on the dock recognized death walking among them. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of storms and deep water. "You have made," he said with terrible calm, "a very serious mistake." What happened next would be talked about in the taverns of Key West for years to come. Elias Blackwater, the reformed pirate who had spent 2 years learning to be gentle, remembered in the space of a heartbeat why men had once crossed themselves when they heard his name. He moved through Marcus's remaining crew like a force of nature, his blade finding gaps in their defenses with surgical precision, his movements those of a man who had learned violence as a second language and never truly forgotten it. Marcus, to his credit, didn't run. When the last of his men lay groaning on the dock, he faced Elias with his sword drawn and that familiar mocking smile on his lips. "There he is," Marcus said with genuine affection. "There's my brother. For a moment I thought I'd lost you to domesticity." They fought the way they'd once fought side by side, with the brutal efficiency of men who had learned their craft in places where second place meant death. Marcus was still skilled, still dangerous, but he had spent 2 years in prison while Elias had spent 2 years building the strength that came from having something to protect. The end came suddenly. Marcus overextended on a thrust aimed at Elias's heart, leaving himself open for just an instant. Elias's blade found the gap, sliding between ribs with the whispered promise of all the men who had died under his command. Marcus looked down at the steel protruding from his chest with something like surprise. "Well," he said, blood beginning to foam at the corners of his mouth. "I suppose that settles old debts." "It settles nothing," Elias said, but his voice was gentle now, almost sorrowful. "Goodbye, brother." Marcus Webb, terror of the Caribbean, slid to his knees and then forward onto his face and lay still. Elias was beside Marin in an instant, his hands checking her wound with the practiced efficiency of a man who had seen too much blood in his lifetime. "How bad?" she asked, though the pallor of her face already told him most of what he needed to know. "Bad enough," he said honestly, "but not bad enough. The bullet went through clean, missed anything vital." He helped her sit up against a piling, then looked around at the carnage on the dock. "Though I think our quiet life just ended." Marin managed a weak smile. "Good thing I like adventure." By morning, word would spread through the Caribbean that Elias Blackwater had returned, that the man who had once commanded the Raven's Call with a crew of cutthroats had killed Marcus Webb and his entire boarding party to protect a woman. Some would say he had gone soft, fighting for love instead of gold. Others would whisper that a man dangerous enough to inspire such loyalty was more dangerous than ever. But as the sun set over Key West, painting the water the color of old blood, Elias cradled Marin against his chest, and felt something he had never expected to feel again. Peace. Not the peace of a man hiding from his past, but the peace of a man who had finally learned the difference between the violence that destroyed and the violence that protected. "So what happens now?" Maren asked, her voice stronger than it had been an hour ago. Elias looked out at the Raven's Call, at the ship they had rebuilt together, then down at the woman who had helped him rebuild himself. "Now we sail," he said simply, "together, and we see what kind of people we can become when we're not running from who we used to be." The tide was turning, carrying away the last traces of blood from the dock, and somewhere in the distance a bell was ringing. Whether in celebration or warning, only time would tell. But for Elias Blackwater and Maren Hollis, time was a luxury they finally had reason to believe they might possess. In the end, the scars they bore, his across his throat, hers across her face, were not marks of damage but proof of survival. And survival, they had learned, was just another word for love that refused to surrender no matter how dark the waters became. The Caribbean night settled over them like a benediction, and two souls who had been forged in violence and tempered by loss sailed toward whatever tomorrow might bring, finally understanding that home was not a place but a choice, made new each day, to stand beside someone who saw your wounds and called them beautiful.